All right, today is day 3 of our STAR countdown review, and we're going to cover evolution today. So make sure you open up your reference or cheat sheet for today if you need to, in case you're not really sure of the material that we're going over. And then also it'll be useful for you to use on your independent practice at the end when you're answering the break questions, and also when you're doing your exit ticket if you need it. At the end of this lesson, you will be able to define common ancestry and describe how the fossil record, biogeography, and homologies can provide evidence of common ancestry among organisms. What is something about evolution that you believe to be true? Tell me one statement about one thing that you think is true about evolution. It can be about evolution in general, it can be about natural selection, monkeys, DNA, Charles Darwin. It can be about your religion or church, or it could be about survival of the fittest. So pause and go ahead and write what you think about evolution in one sentence. Alrighty now, what is evolution? Well, evolution is a theory, right? So it once was an idea, and now it's an idea that has a lot of evidence supporting it, and it helps us explain and answer a lot of questions about where we came from and where everything that is around us came from, right? It predicts how after life began in whatever way it did begin, organisms on Earth diversified into the millions of species we see today. And in fact, maybe species used to even be more diverse. The thing is, we as humans are killing a lot of them and causing a lot of extinctions right now. So the original organisms were born or created, and then time passes and the environment changes naturally, favoring some characteristics more than others. And eventually, there are a bunch of different species. Some are going extinct, some are better than others at surviving, some have different kind of variations. They look different from each other. Some survive and reproduce and then eventually deviate into more different species, or some go extinct after a couple lineage generations. So that's just what we have now. We have this whole mishmash of different species, but we all actually came from one original organism or one original species of organisms, right? So there used to be one population of organisms that was the ancestors to all life. So evolution does not explain how life actually began. Evolution is simply a theory that explains how one species diversified into two species, which diversified over and over and over again. So if you get 2, you get 4, you get 8, you get 16, 32. It keeps going until there were the millions of species we see on Earth today. Many people are religious and believe in evolutionary theory due to all the evidence that supports it. So your religion doesn't have to clash with this, right? You can believe in God and you can believe that God made things, but then also diversity can be increased just naturally by species of organisms changing on their own. So how do we know that the process of evolution is real? Well, there's a lot of evidence, right? There's fossils, there's biogeography, which is basically explaining Pangea and the continent shifting and where fossils were found. There's homologous structures, which are similarities in physical or structures in the bone between organisms that are not technically the same species anymore. There are DNA similarities. So if you just track DNA, you can combine and compare their percent similarities really easily now with our technology. And there's also embryology, where you look at the developing babies of organisms, whether it's in the egg or in the uterus, and you can compare what they look like to see, are they similar or are they not? So there's evidence that evolution is occurring, and we're going to talk about it now. So the first one we're going to talk about is the fossil record. So when you look at the rocks on the surface of the Earth, or that make up the layers of the Earth, the newest rocks are closer to the surface because they're constantly being piled on top of each other. So the most recently piled layer is going to be the newest layer. Fossils can show how a species changed over time because you can track what the species look like by their bones in each layer of the Earth as you're getting from the deeper layers to the shallower layers, and you can track how similar fossils are to each other or how different they are to each other in the different layers. We can also talk about biogeography. As you can see, we have the ancestor to the emu, and the emu currently that has descended from this ancestor is distributed in Australia only. But we have the rhea, which is in Africa, and we have the ostrich, which is in South America. And these three different birds descended from the same ancestor, but they're kind of far apart. So how did they even get there? Because we know that ostriches cannot swim miles and miles and miles and miles across oceans. And then there's no true way to just run across the different continents because they're not connected. So the good reasoning is that back in the past, way, way, way back when the continents were shifting, still a lot more maybe than today, the arrangement of them was different. And the patches where South America, Africa, and Australia were, and this ancestor lived, were actually all really, really close together. So you could actually have the ancestor walk around and end up in these different patches of areas on these different continents. And then eventually they separated. And then as they were separated, the ostriches and the rheas and the emus got more and more different from each other compared to their common ancestor, because they were adapting to their land that they were on now in their different environments. So the basic explanation is that species that live in the same area are more closely related. And Pangea explains why organisms on coastal areas are very similar, because the coastal areas were in contact with different coastal areas of different continents in the past, but now they've shifted apart. So they just kind of look weirdly like having the same species on every continent that all live on the coast, right? That's easily explained by the fact that they all used to be close by to each other when the continents were actually touching. Another type of evidence for evolution is homologous structures. And so this is basically having the same basic pieces with different purposes. So the internal structure of, for example, arms or limbs have the same bones or types of bones, but the purpose that they're used for now are different. Okay, so the example is here, as you can see on the right side, we have the human arm, we have the bat wing, we have a frog arm, a porpoise fin or flipper, and a horse forelimb or foreleg. If you look at the labels for the humerus, radius, ulna, metacarpals, and phalanges, all of them have them. But we know that their purposes are different, right? Humans' arms are for reaching and grabbing, bats are for flying, frogs are for swimming, so are porpoises, and then horses are for running. Okay. This bone internal structure is an example and evidence of having a common ancestor. So long ago, all of these animals in this image all stemmed from one single species, because that species had this original bone structure of having a humerus and having a radius and having an ulna, having metacarpals and having phalanges. But as time went on and species diverged, maybe because of different characteristics or different preferences of living or different food sources, they became more and more different for purposes, but the internal structure has stayed the same, which is also a good indication that the DNA has stayed pretty similar as well. So analogous structures are kind of the opposite if you flip-flop the homologous structure. So analogous structures are different structures, but same function. Okay, so this is an example of convergent evolution, whereas homologous structures were an example of divergent evolution. Because for homologous structures, if you look back here, remember I said their ancestors were the same, but they got more and more different. So they diverged or split up more and more. Analogous structures are actually examples of convergent evolution or coming together because their ancestors are clearly different. If you look at the insect, the dragonfly on the right side here, and the bird on the left side here. But they have the same purpose. So they became more and more similar in their usage, which is convergent evolution. Okay. So they serve the same functions, but they have different evolutionary origins is the basic definition of analogous structures. These are not evidence of common ancestors. Like I said, it's convergent evolution. So they started at different points, not the same ancestors. If you go really far back though, to the first life form, obviously that's still an ancestor for them. But we're talking about like more recently, they don't have a common ancestor, but their purposes that they're using these structures for are quite similar. So if we just look here, same shape in number of bones is homology, right? So if we look at the bat wing here and the human arm, being homologous means you have the same structure. So it would mean that we can assume that these two types of species or two types of organisms will probably have a more recent common ancestor. On the other hand, if we look down here at the wings, wings are used for flight, which means they're analogous, which means they have the same function. Just because they have the same function doesn't mean they have the same internal structure, right? The interesting part about this diagram is that we have a bat wing, a butterfly wing, and a bird wing. But actually, the bones inside the bird wing and the bones inside the bat wing are quite similar. So those two would be considered homologous structures. So this picture is kind of as a definition. But the reason why it's a good example is because this middle one, this butterfly wing right here, it ain't got bones. It has an exoskeleton and it's got scales on it. So it's very different structure, but the purpose is all the same. It's all for flying. Therefore, we can assume that the bird and the butterfly, or the bat and the butterfly, would not have a common ancestor because their internal structures are very different, no matter why or what that their purpose is. Another example of evidence of evolution would be embryology. Now, embryology is really, really cool, but also really, really whack to look at. So if you look at these embryos, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, can you tell me which one is a fish and which one is a human? Which one is a turtle? Which one is a salamander? Which one's a pig? If you can, I'd be really impressed. But I'm gonna tell you, it's really hard starting off. So go ahead and tell me which letter is a fish, human, turtle, salamander, and pig. Make your best guess, pause and do that. So all these organisms look different when they're born, but as embryos, they start to form the same way. So this tells us that these organisms share part of their DNA due to common ancestry, right? As we look in the background here, you can see that this is a fish, this one over here is a human, this one's a turtle, this one's a salamander. There's ones in here that are, what was there earlier? This one's a pig. They're all really, 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 really similar in the beginning. That's the whole point, is that the reason why they look similar is that their common ancestor developed this way. And because it's a successful way of developing and surviving and becoming a living creature, almost all the descendants also develop this way, whether it's inside of an egg or inside of a uterus. They develop this way, so they initially look really, really similar, but as they start to form more complex characteristics, they start to look more and more different. And by the time they're usually hatched or born, they look like pretty similar to what they're going to look like as an adult. But the important part is that as the initial stages of an embryo, they look quite similar. And the more similar they look, the more recent their common ancestor is, or basically the more related they probably are. Another easy one that I just talked about earlier is looking at DNA sequences, right? The more similar a DNA sequence is between two species, the more recently they diverged from a common ancestor. So the examples would be looking at orangutans, gorillas, chimps, and humans, right? There's a lot of matching parts on their chromosomes. And that's just because the recent common ancestor was maybe only a couple million years ago instead of like hundreds of million years ago or billions of years ago. The more recent the common ancestor means that your great 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 times 100 grandpa might have been the same organism, right? Probably wasn't a human, probably wasn't a chimp, but it was something that was an ancestor to both species, right? So that doesn't mean that you're cousins with a monkey, even if you act crazy. But it does mean that at some point in time in history, we and monkeys became more and more and more different based on our living habits and our natural habitats. So as a recap, the evidence of evolution is constantly occurring, right? Fossils are being made even today. We collect the ones from a long time ago, but fossils are being made even today. So fossils are a good example of evidence of evolution because we can track them and look at the changes in time based on the layers of rock that they belong to. We can look at the biogeographical distribution of organisms, basically where their ancestors are found on different continents, and compare maybe where the continents used to be. We can compare homologous structures, mainly internal bone structures. We can compare DNA sequences using a very cool tool called BLAST, and you can actually literally compare to the 0.000001% chance of how similar organisms are based on just their DNA sequences of their proteins, of their actual DNA, of their mRNA. It's really cool. And then we can also look at embryology, or the developmental stages of organisms, to see, are they closely related or are they distantly related to a common ancestor? Now, there are some mechanisms that can cause evolution, so let's talk about them. Natural selection is one of the mechanisms and the most well-known mechanism that causes evolution or causes change over time. So the first thing you need to have for natural selection is that a species has variation. So not all individuals inside of a species looks the same, right? Or acts the same, or is the same just intrinsically, right? So for example, in giraffes, there could be some giraffes that are tall, some giraffes that are short, and that is variation because they're not all identical to each other. That's important. Okay. A second thing that needs to be present for natural selection to work is that there has to be competition within that species, right? There has to be some organisms that need these resources and they're going to have to be better or worse at getting them compared to each other. Okay. So some organisms are going to be better and some organisms are going to be worse. And generally, the better ones will be able to survive better, right? So there is competition. It means everybody needs a food source and there might not be enough for everyone. The third one, like I just said, is the better adapted members of these species are more likely to survive. But the emphasis is that they'll survive and they'll pass their genes on, right? So if they survive, they have more time and more chances to pass their genes on. So survival of the fittest is important, but not as important as reproduction of the fittest. So the fourth and final thing that we're talking about for natural selection would be, again, these survivors will pass on their better genes to their offspring who will also show this beneficial variation, which means that after competing and showing which one is better and more fit for this current environment at this current time in this current period of history, when you pass on these genes and your offspring have it, they're also more likely to survive. And then they're also more likely to be able to go on and reproduce and pass these same genes on as long as they're beneficial. If the environment changes, that might not be true anymore. Mutations are a good source of variation, and they happen naturally and randomly. So mutations will create a variation. For example, if originally a population was only this middle brown color, mutations might create lighter variations and darker variations. And then based on the environment, unfavorable mutations are selected against, which means they're dying out. So there's going to be reproduction and potentially more random mutations that are happening that are going to create more variations of different kinds of phenotypes or behaviors, right? And then again, the more favorable mutations are more likely to survive and reproduce. So at the very end, after a certain period of time, the population won't look anything like the initial population because whatever fits the environment the best is what is surviving the best and reproducing the best, right? So it's not just always going to have a perfect range of everything, right? It's going to probably favor and have a lot of individuals who have that well-fit phenotype or characteristic that lets them survive better in the environment. Gene flow is a thing that is also called migration, and it's the random movement of organisms from one population to another. It brings genes into the population, and that allows evolution to happen because if you're mixing genes or you're changing the ratio of genes in different populations, that is change over time. So if you look at this picture or diagram over here, originally we have two separate populations. One is green beetles, one is brown beetles. If you have a brown beetle, oops, my bad. If you have a brown beetle that migrates over to the green beetle population, that is gene flow because it is bringing its genes from one population into a different population. So now the gene ratio here isn't 100% green anymore, right? If it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 green and 1 brown, it's close to like a 1 to 10 ratio. Sorry, it's going to be a 1 to 8 ratio, but what percentage would that be? It would be a little bit over, it would be around like 12% brown genes and then 88% green genes, right? So that is changing the ratio from 100% green to something else now. And since it left, it took its genes away. So now the genes over here are less than original for whatever it is. Even if it's just coloration that you can see right now, it could be other genes for other proteins, for other behaviors, for other characteristics that it took with it to go to another population. The bottleneck effect is a type of genetic drift. It's an event, usually some kind of random, natural, unavoidable event that drastically reduces the size of a population and causes some genes to be lost forever. So the reason we call it a bottleneck is because when you pour, for example, a drink out of a bottle that has a really small opening, only a little bit of things come out first. And then if you just take the rest of the bottle away, that's all you get. And so when you're pouring out beads from an original bottle population, whatever comes out, comes out. And after you got a couple, that means the rest are all dying from this natural disaster, for example, like a hurricane or tornado, right? The surviving population is going to repopulate back to the original size of the original population. But the gene ratio here is now different because only a couple survived. And whilst the dominant color over here was going to be that tan, orangey yellow color, since just by chance, mostly the pink individuals survived. In this new population, it's going to be mostly pink survivors, and it's going to be mostly populated with pink individuals, just because that was by chance the ratio that survived the bottleneck event. The founder's effect is kind of similar, where you're founding a new population, right? So it's like when the Pilgrims came over to the Americas, I guess they called it back then. So one or a few individuals leave the original population to start their own colony. And this new population has a totally different set of circumstances that affect the gene pool. So if there's originally a population of ladybugs that are diverse and have different colors, but only the red ones leave to colonize a new population, well, this new population is probably mainly just going to be red ladybugs because they're not bringing the genes of any of the green ones to start this new population and populate and grow and grow and grow into a bigger population. So they're just starting with red, and they're probably going to get bigger and bigger and bigger populations of just red. So newly founded populations don't always represent the genetic diversity that they're sourced from, because if you only have red genes, you can only give red genes into the next generation. Geographic isolation is one way that gene ratios change over time as well. So here we have a chasm forming that is going to divide a population in half, and one half the population on the north side of the chasm might have different conditions that they have to survive in than the ones in the south side of this new gap. And so they're adapting slowly over time and changing over time, because whatever helps them survive best in their new environment is what is going to be the most favorable characteristic, and most individuals will have that. When they become more and more and more different, and then they cannot mate together anymore, even when reunited, that means that there has been speciation, or a new species has been created, or two, depending on if they compare to their own old species or not over here. Okay, so geographic isolation can cause organisms that used to be in the same species to occupy different niches or different jobs in their environment. And eventually, if they become different enough and they can't mate together anymore, they're going to become different species in the process of speciation. Reproductive isolation is another way to separate species out into new species. And that's just when two individuals can no longer mate with each other. That's what I mentioned in the last one, right? Sometimes they can mate together, but when they mate together, their babies are not viable, aka their babies are not fertile, right? A lot of hybrids between species do exist, but those hybrids cannot have children themselves, right? So an example here would be two frogs, and the frog over here is like, hey, girl, what you looking at? And then the girl over here is like, not interested, right? Because they mate in different locations. So they're never actually going to meet up together to mate. Right? That would be reproductive isolation, means that you can't even mate together. There's other ones where the genitals of organisms are not compatible. There's ones where after the sperm and the egg meet, they automatically kills off the embryo inside of the womb because it's not compatible with the mother's body. There's ones where the baby is born, but the baby is actually born dead. There's also ones where the baby is born, like I said, a hybrid is made, but the baby itself, that hybrid, cannot reproduce any further. So they're not going to be creating a new lineage at all. So that is reproductive isolation, when two individuals can no longer mate with each other. So I'm going to ask that you try this question now, and you're going to answer, which condition is essentially for natural selection to result in a new species? Is it having unlimited resources, aka no competition? Is it an inherited variation, aka variations are passed down through genes? Is it a static environment, or environment that never changes ever? Or is it a long lifespan where organisms rarely ever die? Tell me the answer to this question. Pause and go ahead and do that in your Pear Deck. So does evolution mean we came from monkeys? This is what I answered earlier, but the good question is something that people ask all the time because they're not really sure what evolution is, or they're still not really sure then how or what it means to have an ancestor with monkeys. And the answer is no. Okay. Again, like I said before, no matter how crazy you act around other people, we didn't actually come from monkeys. Okay, humans and monkeys and other organisms have similar DNA and traits because we share a recent common ancestor. Like I said, a couple million years ago, there was an organism before monkeys or before humans existed. And that organism eventually, when it occupied different locations or started doing different things, the groups became more and more different. And one of those groups eventually became humans, and one of those groups eventually became chimpanzees. So if you really want to say it, we're not actually coming from monkeys, but we have a common ancestor with them. So if you say great, 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 great times 600, grandpa, that might have been that ancestor that was the same one that monkeys also have if they went that same amount of generations back. So that common ancestor, through some mechanism of evolution, evolved into the modern human and the monkey species we see today. Again, it's by chance and by the environment changing and by natural things that are happening. It's not really a purposeful evolution either, because evolution does not have a goal. So evolution recap would be that there's evidence, right? We see in the fossil record, biogeography, homologous structures, DNA similarities, and embryology that proves that evolution has occurred and will continue to occur. And then the ways that evolution occurs, the processes and mechanisms are natural selection, mutation, gene flow or migration, bottleneck effect, founder's effect, and reproductive isolation. So let's do a problem together as practice, and then you're going to do some independent work. So again, we're going to use the rake method. Remember to read and highlight first. You're going to ask, what is the question asking? You're going to put out your knowledge on this question or this topic, and then you're going to lastly eliminate and choose your best answer. So let me move myself out of the way. The question here is, 3 species of lizards of the genus Galatea are found in the Canary Islands, a chain of 7 volcanic islands off the west coast of Africa. The easternmost island, Lanzarote, is the oldest, while the westernmost island, El Hierro, is the youngest. The distribution of lizard species is shown in the map below. So we have this big map, and then you have a zoomed out version of it that shows kind of where the Canary Islands, these ones, are in kind of relative to the larger continents it's next to. Okay, so we have a key that represents the markings of 3 different species of lizards, and they're all in the same genus because they all share this first name together. So we have Galatea galati, we have Galatea stellini, we have Galatea atlantica. Which statement about the ancestry of the lizards from the genus Galatea is best supported by this information? Is it A, the common ancestor of the lizards first colonized the island of El Hierro, or B, the ancestors of each species came from different continents at different times, or C, the common ancestor of the lizards probably came from Africa, or D, the ancestors of each species evolved in Spain and were brought to the islands at the same time? So the first thing we're going to need to do is to read and highlight. So based on that, I have highlighted the important things, right? We're looking at the Canary Islands. We got their volcanic islands, which means they formed pretty recently, right? Because when volcanoes spew out their lava, that cools and becomes new islands in the ocean. We're looking at the distribution of the lizards, and we're looking at the map below. So this map is super important for us to observe. Now we're going to rephrase the question by saying, what is it asking? So it's asking, looking at the map of the new islands created by volcanoes, what do we know about the ancestors of these lizards, right? We're not talking about the current lizards. We're talking about where did they come from? So now we're going to express our relevant knowledge or the knowledge related to this question that we have. Whether or not you have a lot of knowledge about lizards or evolution, if you need help with that, you can always look on the cheat sheet. So the knowledge that we have on this is that very similar species found on newly formed islands were likely to come from the same common ancestor. And that common ancestor probably was migrating from a nearby continent. So when you look at this close-up of the Canary Islands, what is the nearby continent? So we're going to now get to the last step where we're going to eliminate the wrong answers or the nonsense, right? So in answer A down here, it says the common ancestors of lizards first colonized the island of El Hierro. And actually, that's really, really far away from the mainland. So that's probably wrong. In B, it says the ancestors of each species came from different continents at different times. Well, they're all related to each other, so they probably came from each other. So why would they be coming at different times from different places when they probably evolved from each other in that same location that they were already in? And then in D, it says the ancestors of each species evolved in Spain and were brought to the islands at the same time. Spain's not even close, right? If you look at the zoomed out map, Spain is up here. The closest place would be Africa, right? So our correct answer is going to be C. The common ancestor of the lizards probably came from Africa. And it was just that simple. All right. So now you are going to do a couple on your own. So in the pair deck now, it's going to be independent and self-paced mode for students. You're going to use your rake method. And if you need to, again, open up the cheat sheet that I linked in the Google post. You're going to answer the questions here. So you're going to have a question that's talking again about Galatia on the Canary Islands, but a different format. So make sure you read the diagram carefully. You're going to be talking about the bones of a genera of primates. So they're kind of related to us, actually. And you're going to figure out the best answer here. And lastly, we're going to talk about camels, llamas, alpacas, and their family Camelidae. And you're going to make sure you use the rake method. So I should see some highlighting. I should see some writing here for asking, writing here for knowledge, and then I should see which ones you're eliminating and which sections cause you to eliminate them. So go ahead and do your independent work. And then at the end, you're going to have an exit ticket that you're going to show me what you learned today in the review, if you learned anything, or what you remember from the review. And we'll see kind of as a predictor how you'll do on your STAAR test.